33 years ago, he was jailed for the murder of a shopkeeper in East London. He spent 10 years behind bars and more than 20 out on licence until last week, when his conviction was quashed at the Court of Appeal. 3 judges ruled there was a high risk a confession he had made was unsafe. Did you feel pressured to make a confession?
Yes, 100% yes.
Ever wonder why a totally innocent person would confess to a crime they never committed? A false confession. It's actually more common than you would think. Why? Is it fear? Manipulation? Desperation? In this case, was brain damage, a brain injury the cause of the false confession? One untrue sentence could send somebody away to prison. And that's exactly what happened here. Thanks for tuning in to another case in my Wrongly Convicted crime series. This is the story of Oliver Campbell. Oliver was born in the UK and is of Jamaican descent. As a baby, at only 8 months old, he suffered a serious, heavy blow to the head. Not only did his injury leave Oliver with limited use of his right hand, but it also left him severely brain damaged. This brain injury affected his whole life. It caused him to have learning difficulties, impaired memory, and lack of reasoning skills. I couldn't find the exact cause of his brain injury, but I did read that there was some parental abuse in his life, so that may possibly be the cause, who knows. But clearly, Oliver's life was made more difficult as he was battling with the effects of his brain injury. It lowered his IQ, and as a result, he functioned at the level of like a 7-year-old. He was affectionately referred to as the gentle giant because he was a bigger boy. He was really tall. As a teenager, he towered over most other teenagers at 6'3", and he had a very large physique. He found himself in the system, in a care home for children. At 16 years old, he ended up being placed with his foster parent, Jean Jackson. Her role was to prepare him for living independently as an adult. Usually, this type of foster placement would be for 2 years, but because of Oliver's severe learning difficulties, his placement was actually for 3. Oliver grew up in East London, near a place called Hackney, which is among one of the most crime-ridden boroughs in London, I would say. He was generally of really good character, except for once he did vandalise a telephone booth, but nothing too crazy. In 1990, Oliver, then aged 19, had recently left foster care. He was with some friends, some older men from the area. For some reason, you often see older men with younger friends, maybe because they're more impressionable and easier to manipulate for their own benefit. And given Oliver's learning difficulties, I can imagine the scenario all too well. So one of Oliver's friends was a man called Eric Samuels. Actually, the word friend is probably used too loosely here. I think acquaintance would be better, because in this case, I don't think Eric really acted much like a good friend. It was July 22nd, 1990. Oliver, Eric, and another man who went by the name of Harvey were all hanging out in the West End of London near Leicester Square. Oliver was wearing a brand new cap, a very distinctive black and white cap with the slogan British Knights plastered on the front of the cap. And Oliver had just bought this hat maybe a week prior to this. But this guy Harvey, he must have taken, a liking to Oliver's hat. So he stole it, just took it clean off Oliver's head. Eric reported that there wasn't much that Oliver could do about it, so they just left the situation alone. You see what I mean when I say the description of friends should be used very loosely? Anyway, Oliver ended up just leaving, so Eric and Harvey continued hanging out without Oliver. And here is where the whole story begins to go downhill. That same day, around 10:30 p.m, Eric and Harvey decided that they wanted to rob a store. When discussing potential places to rob, Eric suggested it would be too risky to commit the robbery in the West End of London. I mean, it was a very busy place, too many people, too much surveillance, possibly police around. So Eric suggested that they rob a place local to him, a smaller store, what we call in the UK an off-licence, like a corner shop. The two men picked this store, G&H Supermarket. It was located in Clapton Road in Hackney. Eric entered the shop alone and he did a quick scan just to prep the layout for the crime. Eric noticed that there was somebody, outside of the store doing the window shutters for closing, and he pushed that employee into the store, probably to prevent, them running and seeking help. So both men, Eric and Harvey, carried out the attempted robbery. The shop owner, Mr. Baldev Hundal, and Harvey began tussling. Mr. Hundal's son, Hardip, was also in the store at the time of the robbery. Hardip later reported that he saw something silver in one of the men's hands, so he immediately pressed the panic button. Hardip said, "All I heard was a bang. My father fell to the ground." Mr. Hundal was profusely bleeding from the neck, and sadly he died from this nonsensical attempted robbery. I can't even imagine, as a young son, witnessing your own dad being shot to death point blank in his own store in front of you. That's traumatizing, just a wicked, disgusting act. They were simply running their business in the local area when he was killed. They weren't doing anything wrong, and for what? His son was really brave to have set off the alarms as he stared in the gunman's face, because for all he knew, the robbers could have turned on him next. But instead, Eric and Harvey fled the store, and they discarded their clothes en route. And one of the discarded items was the British Knight's cap, Oliver's distinctive black and white cap. Following the shooting, an Australian man by the name of Mark Purchase came forward to help the police. He claimed he had heard the gunshot and witnessed two men running away from the scene of the crime. Mark initially described the robbers as being around 5'10" in height and claimed that both of the robbers were roughly the same height. Mark also found a discarded piece of evidence on the roadside. And what was this crucial piece? The British Knight's cap. Mark had seen one of the robbers wearing that cap. However, in an ID parade, Mark did not initially identify Oliver as a suspect. A woman, a bystander, she also witnessed the men outside the store, but she also didn't pick out Oliver from the ID parade. And lastly, Hardip, Mr. Hundal's son, was certain he could pick out the shooter in a police lineup. However, he also didn't recognise Oliver in the lineup. So that's 3 eyewitnesses, Mark, the female bystander, and Hardip, who all failed to pick out the friendly giant 6'3" Oliver to be one of the robbers. However, despite this, Oliver was now a key witness for the shooting. But of course, he wasn't even there. So it's going to be cleared up in further questioning, right? So, how did Oliver end up getting convicted for this crime? Only 188 British nightcaps had been sold in London. An employee of a local sports shop, it was called Jubilee Sports, stated that Oliver had purchased the hat 8 days before the shooting, which we already knew he did. But what I feel probably raised some suspicions was that Oliver returned back to that sports shop and told the shop employee that somebody's been to see me about that hat I bought. I told them I gave it away. So I know you're probably thinking, why would Oliver go out of his way to say this? But you have to remember, Oliver had suffered a brain injury, which severely affected his response and how he reacted to certain situations. He later explained that he told the employee this because he had seen details of the crime on this TV show called Crime Watch. This was a show that reported local crimes and sought out leads from the public. He explained that he was scared that the police would wrongly trace the hat back to him as the shooter. So I guess he was trying to get ahead of the narrative in a way. So you can put the pieces of the story together and see why 4 months later, after Hundel's murder, in November 1990, Oliver was arrested. He was extensively questioned by the police over multiple interviews. I believe he was interviewed 14 times over the course of 3 or 4 days, and that's a lot of questioning. And with his intellectual disabilities and his impaired memory, it was extremely hard for Oliver to keep up. He was told he was being arrested for the shooting at the store, and initially Oliver said he knew nothing about it. But as the interviews went on and on and on, his story changed. He started telling the officers more and more. He said he didn't want a solicitor, a lawyer present. Notably, some of what Oliver was telling the police officers was, well, just confusing. Absurd at times. His story, it didn't really make sense. He said he might have been to the store a long time ago. First he insisted he didn't do the shooting, and then he said it was both of them. And then he said it was his friend Derek, not Eric, who had the gun. Oliver said he had told some girls what he had done, and he was kind of scared and wanted to know if they had snitched on him. When asked what time the shooting occurred, Oliver said it happened around 6:30 p.m, but then he said it happened late at night at store closing. You see where I'm going with this? Oliver's interviews were just all over the place. And why? Obviously because of his intellectual disability. He was having difficulty concentrating and comprehending the barrage of complicated questions the police were just firing at him during these interviews. Contrary to best practice, some of these interviews weren't even recorded properly for evidence.
First thing you can tell with Oliver is that he has learning difficulties, and he's in some ways backwards, for use of a better word, and that he's clumsy as well, and that he would be behaving like a child, especially then at the age of 19, and he should definitely have had legal representation straight away.
After the first interview, thankfully, Oliver was examined by a medical professional and finally provided a solicitor and an appropriate adult. In the UK, an appropriate adult is like a responsible person. It's ideally a parent or a social worker, somebody who can support them during police interviews to ensure that their rights are being protected and their well-being is being safeguarded. However, even legal representation and his appropriate adult there, Oliver continued to spew more incoherent, confusing testimony in the interviews. It's totally not his fault, nor something he could help. He then contradicted his earlier story, saying he didn't know anything about the shootings, that neither he nor Derek had a gun, and he protested that he simply said what he had said earlier to get the police off his back. He did admit that the British Knight's cap was his, after the police suggested, or should I say misled, him to believe that sample of Oliver's hair would match the hair sample taken from the cap. The police also inferred that Oliver's fingerprints had been found in the shop. So essentially, the police had lied about having forensic evidence linking Oliver to the crime, when in fact they had none. The DNA, the result of the hair sample, didn't even match Oliver, and none of his fingerprints were found at the scene. They also lied, claiming that they had lots of witnesses linking Oliver to the crime. which wasn't exactly true. None of the witnesses had actually linked Oliver to the shop. Remember the Australian witness Mark Purchase, who had claimed to have seen both men around 5'10" running from the store? Well, remember, Mark didn't point out Oliver in the ID line parade. So please tell me why. 6 weeks later, a whole 6 weeks later, he magically changed his answer and said that he saw Oliver and he identified Oliver, 6'3" Oliver in the lineup. Like, come on, stop it. It appears the police had fed him information, so he changed his answer. Just another unfair investigative practice, especially since his change of answer didn't match the answer of Mr. Hundel's son, nor the female eyewitness, because neither of them picked out Oliver. Mark was clearly very confused about what he saw that evening, as evidenced in the phone call he had with some reporters. Indeed, the judge even warned the jury to be cautious of Mark's eyewitness testimony during the trial.
Because in the initial statement that you gave, you said they were both about 5'10". They're both about the same.
One was about a head taller than the other one.
Right. I only ask about it because in one of your initial statements you said they were both about 5'10". You see. That's.
One was definitely tall. I think the one that was slightly taller, I think it was a bomber jacket he had on, actually.
We spoke to Mark Purchase for an hour, but he couldn't give us a consistent story. The same problem the judge had identified in court.
In my opinion, it should have been obvious, blatantly obvious, that Oliver was intellectually struggling with the interview, and that what he was saying should have been taken with caution, with a grain of salt. Most of the following interviews, up to interview number 9, Oliver proceeded to just answer no comment, no comment, no comment to the majority of questions asked. He was getting worn down with the interview process. But it's not surprising given the stressful circumstances that interviews number 10 and 11, things began to take a sharp turn for the worst. That evening, Oliver's lawyer left around 7 p.m. for the night. The lawyer left his telephone number with the police with strict instructions to call him if they decided to interview Oliver again later that night. Well, 30 minutes later, Oliver's foster mother, Jean Jackson, came to the police station to visit Oliver. An officer asked Jean to act as his appropriate adult, and Jean agreed. Both Oliver and Jean signed the custody record, confirming that they were okay to continue without the lawyer present. Of course the police didn't call the lawyer back. Of course not. Jean has since discussed her role as an appropriate adult and expresses some guilt in not fully understanding the seriousness that her role entailed that evening. I felt a bit sorry for her because she seemed to partly blame herself for the outcome of the interview, but I have to give Jean some grace because she seems like a really caring and supportive foster mother who was just trying to help her foster son. I personally question how much detail the police offered when they explained the implications of waiving the right to having a lawyer there. It seems to me that both Jean and Oliver just didn't really understand. Oliver said, "Something inside me is wanting to tell the truth. It's like a door opening inside me. I don't want to lie. I shot the Asian man." At this point, with this confession, it was all over for Oliver. Mind you, this was a false confession. But do you think the police really cared? They'd already manipulated him in the interview, this time without a lawyer. And of course, out of all the interviews, this was the one he confessed. Come off it. Interview number 11 went just as badly. False statements galore. Again with no lawyer present, just only Jean, his foster mother, there. It should have been obvious from his poor articulation that something was strange about his confession. Oliver told the police that it was him who shot the man by accidentally pulling the trigger. He said he had hired the gun but couldn't remember who from, and that he practiced shooting in the local park but he couldn't remember where or the name of the park. He said he dropped the British Knight's cap inside the store, but we know this is inconsistent with what really happened because the hat was actually found on the street. Oliver stated that the gun was black in colour, but we know that the gun was actually silver. He even concocted a story saying that he used string to make a holster to carry the gun under his left arm. Like string, really? This string contraption would have required Oliver to have used his right hand to remove the gun. Well, remember, Oliver's brain injury had mostly affected one side of his body and his right hand was much weaker. He basically had limited use of his right hand and it would have been near impossible. And ballistics showed that the shooter was indeed right-handed. And this point is so important because Oliver is left-handed, but it was never explored in the trial. So I'll just leave that point there.
The nonsense was the admissions that he made, which involved his admitting, for example, and bear in mind that he's heavily left-handed, he admitted to police that using his weak hand, his right hand, and your viewers may want to think about how they could do this, he managed somehow to make a holster out of 2 pieces of string and carried the gun in that, and then had to untie the pieces of string in the shop in order to produce the gun. Well, first of all, how was that physically possible? And we now know from neurologists that he couldn't have done it physically because of the fact that his right hand was so weak.
I want to touch on the topic of false confessions because it was apparent that this was one. Even if the police wouldn't admit it, Oliver's confession was clearly fabricated. False confessions happen for a number of reasons. For example, psychological pressure when being interrogated. The police questioning was quoted as being misleading, bullying, and just unfair. The police exaggerated the extent of the evidence that they had on Oliver because they presumed he was guilty from the start. They were so focused on getting that confession out of him rather than exploring, the possibility whether he could actually be innocent. When somebody thinks something about you and they're wrong, sometimes it just seems so overwhelming to fight to try and get them to change their mind that you sort of just give in. Okay, yeah, I did it. Maybe admitting the crime would just make this whole ordeal come to an end. They interviewed Oliver so many times. Not once, not twice, not 5 times, 14 times. That's a lot of prolonged stress, so it was inevitable somebody as vulnerable as Oliver would crack. And he cracked on interview 10 with no lawyer present. But the biggest factor to Oliver's false confession was obviously his intellectual disabilities. Oliver had an IQ level of 75 and his brain injury caused him to agree with complex questions he didn't quite understand. His memory recall was poor, so if he was posed a question, he would just be likely to comply with yes. Even though when looking at his facial expressions, you can kind of tell he had no idea. And Oliver's mental impairment made it so he wanted to fit in, to people please, even if he didn't quite fully understand the situation. It's not a malicious characteristic, it's just how his brain functions. So when the police gave Oliver suggestions as a way out scenario that Oliver had shot Mr. Hundel by accident thinking that the gun was empty, of course, Oliver just agreed and gave this exact same explanation in his confession. It all just sounded absurd.
Normal. He's a limited individual and he's developed a strategy which has involved facilitating conversation in a very acquiescent way. So he picks up pieces of information and with those pieces of information sustains conversation without real meaning.
During interview 12, Jean and Oliver then stopped the interview, requesting a lawyer. Jean, she was noticeably stressed. She said she felt physically sick. So the remaining 13th and 14th interview, they were conducted with the lawyer, but the lawyer did pick up on some of the police's bullying tactics, trying to stop it, but quite frankly, it was too late. The damage was done. The police had already manipulated the circumstances, feeding false details to him to get this confession. But wait, what about Eric? You know, Eric Samuels, the other friend who was part of the robbery? Well, he was arrested. Eric claimed that he didn't even know Oliver had a gun and that he was outside the shop when the shooting even took place. In my opinion, Eric was just telling a pack of lies. He knew Oliver wasn't as intellectually sharp as him. So it appears Eric just said whatever he needed to say to get himself out of trouble, and it worked. Because Eric only ended up getting 5 years, convicted of robbery, and escaped the murder charges. But in a later statement, Eric told a police officer that it was actually Harvey, not Oliver, who was with him during that fateful night. This grave admission was never heard in the courtroom. They classed Eric's statements as hearsay because he never formally gave an official report. Eric's statement about Harvey being responsible was held inadmissible because they weren't said under caution. In 1990, Eric told the police, "I was going to tell you before, but the solicitor told me not to." But Oliver wasn't there. Just some shady motives. On legal advice to protect himself, Eric would not sign a statement. Because of this, he was never cross-examined in the trial. So the jury never heard this vital piece of information that Oliver was not even present at the robbery. You're trying to tell me that your party to the robbery, Eric, told police that another man was with him during the crime and this wasn't explored? Like, what? Why? You cannot tell me the police didn't simply ignore this key suspect in order to stick it on Oliver. Because sadly to them, it was probably easier. They just clearly took this fake confession and ran with it. Why bother doing even more work, pursuing Harvey, getting statements from Harvey, doing all this, when they could just nab this mentally disabled guy and be one and done and finish with the case. Wrap it up. It's just disappointing. So what about this Harvey guy? Eric said he actually already had previous convictions, some were relating to gun crimes. What I find shocking is that the police actually did call Harvey in for interview 5 weeks after Oliver's confession. They did question Harvey, and he said he knew nothing about the shooting, that he didn't know Oliver, he didn't know Eric, and he didn't wear hats. And when he was asked if he was prepared to provide a hair sample to see if it matched what was in the cap, he asked for his lawyer, and no hair sample was taken from Harvey, which is crazy to me since the hair sample didn't match Eric and it didn't match Oliver. So why, oh why, wouldn't they push for the hair sample from Harvey to at the very least be tested to rule him out? The fingerprints found at the scene of the crime weren't further explored either. You know, it makes me question whether they were Harvey's. But I guess we will never know, will we? So in the trial, you can guess what happens. Oliver gets convicted of both charges, conspiracy to rob and also convicted of the murder of Mr. Hundel. Oliver was just beginning his life now at 21, but he was about to begin a life sentence, whereas Eric was only convicted for the robbery. And Eric didn't even have to give evidence in court. Oliver did, however, and he struggled. In court, he retracted his statement. He told the court that he wasn't involved in the robbery. He said he was somewhere else, but he couldn't remember where. Because he had poor memory recognition, of course. In my opinion, Oliver didn't get a fair trial because his mental impairments would have required a lot of reasonable adjustments to accommodate his vulnerability, and he just didn't have it. But Oliver was sentenced to life with a minimum of 10 years. An innocent man sent to prison. Absolutely no DNA or fingerprint evidence linking Oliver to the crime. In 1994, Oliver first attempted to appeal his conviction. This appeal was based on the fact that Eric, now in prison, had told his inmate, a man called Sanderson, that the man that was with him during the robbery was not Oliver. The court held this evidence inadmissible and refused the appeal. He also tried to appeal on the fact that his initial mental evaluation didn't fully convey how vulnerable and suggestible he was due to his learning difficulties. But again, the judge threw out his appeal and things weren't looking promising. Then a few years later, in 2001, a TV reporter, Linda Cowell, was investigating Oliver's case for a TV show called Rough Justice. She managed to track down Eric since he had now been released from prison, whilst Oliver was still locked up fighting for justice. I got to give it to Linda and her team because when I say they searched for Eric, they were literally up and down the streets of London looking for him. They were asking everybody, homeless people, if they had seen or heard of Eric. And miraculously, somehow, they found him. And Linda spoke with Eric while secretly recording their whole conversation. And in this conversation, Eric again admitted he was with Harvey and not with Oliver during the robbery. The camera secretly recorded Eric saying it's not even nothing to do with him. His face was blurred out in the video because Eric seemed scared and telling the truth could potentially implicate him.
This piece of paper. It's a version of events Samuels gave the police before the trial. It completely exonerates Oliver Campbell. Campbell wasn't there, but he won't release this statement or give us an interview because he's so terrified about the reaction of the real murderer. We decided it was in the public interest to record secretly what Eric Samuels had to say, but to protect his identity.
Do you remember it well?
Yeah, good one.
Really? I mean, I know that you want to help.
Tell the truth, that's all. About Oliver wasn't there and things like that. Tell them the whole story, how the incident happened, and then how Oliver was connected to the incident. Sworn statement that he's not there. He wasn't there at the time.
Meanwhile, Oliver remained in prison, protesting that he'd been used as a scapegoat. Despite all this evidence and attempts at appeal, Oliver ended up serving his whole prison sentence, spending 11 long years in prison for a crime he didn't commit.
They've used me as a scapegoat to cover up all the wrongdoing what different types of people's done from 90 and 91, and at the day the police, I think the police, the Crown prosecution and everyone involved in this case knows who committed the crime at the end of the day, but they've turned a blind eye and it's like they've put their heads down a hole and said we're not taking any notice of an innocent person.
So even though he was classed as a convicted murderer and did his time, you might think that would be it. Too late for justice. Nope, even once Oliver was released in 2002, he continued to insist he was innocent all along. So the fight, now from outside of prison, continued. Even though he was out of prison, there were strict conditions on Oliver's freedom. A life license was hanging over his head. He couldn't leave the country without permission, get a job without permission. He couldn't even stay overnight somewhere without getting permission. He really wasn't free, and it was important to clear his name. So how did Oliver eventually clear his name? How did he get exonerated? Unfortunately, Oliver's conviction wasn't quashed until September 2024. So that was over 30 years of trying to get justice. The Court of Appeal finally accepted that the psychological science had advanced so much in modern times that if his case had been tried today, the outcome would have been very different. The laws surrounding how vulnerable people are treated in the justice system had drastically changed. The Criminal Cases Review Commission is a watchdog that refers cases of wrongfully convicted people. They basically thought his conviction was unsafe. And when they referred his case to the Court of Appeal, they were right. They were right. Oliver's convictions were finally quashed in September 2024. Oliver and his legal team tirelessly fought for 33 years. What's very sad is hearing Oliver talk about, all the things he could have done if he hadn't been locked over for over a decade. For example, he said his conviction stopped him working with horses within the community. He complained that, he could have got married, he could have had kids, he could have gone overseas on holiday, like he hadn't even gone abroad. You can see the bitterness in his eyes and the sadness when he speaks, but he's so calm and composed.
What questions do you think still need to be answered?
Who's the person who killed the shopkeeper?
Does that weigh on your mind? Is that something you think about a lot?
Every day and night.
The barriers to obtaining compensation in the UK after a false conviction are just crazy high. Very few are actually able to meet this hurdle, so most people actually end up being denied compensation. And this can't be justice. This can't be justice. And let's not forget the innocent victim, Mr. Hundal, and his family. They've been very quiet since Oliver's conviction got overturned. I can't imagine how it must feel to, believe that justice had been served and then that conviction just get overturned more than 30 years later and realise that actually there had been no real closure to the case. My heart goes out to them also because they never really truly received justice, because the real murderer, he was never caught. He could potentially still be running around London right now. Who knows? Oliver himself feels that if the real murderer is never caught, he can never truly be free. It's just a sad outcome from both sides of the story.
The only time there's going to be freedom is if certain authorities reopen the case and go after the person who done it.
Although Oliver's convictions have been thrown out, in many ways, this case it doesn't feel right to me. Something still feels off. I find it crazy how the police were unable or unwilling to find a confession from a clearly mentally impaired man problematic. Like, his confession barely made any sense in itself. And the police failed him. They were malicious because they knew Oliver was vulnerable and he had low IQ. It irks my soul that Oliver's first attempt to appeal his conviction was rejected. His legal team presented 17 key reasons why the case was flawed. And it wasn't until they actually published these findings to the general public, which garnered enough support for Oliver, that the courts decided to relook at the case again. Because, justice doesn't really matter to them. But we can't have public outrage. And Eric, he's since died. But I honestly feel like more work should have been done pursuing his confessions rather than Oliver's. I do put some of the responsibility squarely on Eric's shoulders because he sounded like he really wanted to save himself, to get that lesser charge. Okay, he might have been acting on the advice of his lawyer, but I don't know how he could be content just living his life knowing that Oliver was found guilty when he wasn't even present at the robbery. I feel like Eric could and should have done more. He could have fought harder to expose the truth rather than just sitting back and letting, the reporters hunt him down to secretly record him admitting it. Self-preservation, I guess, at the expense of Oliver's livelihood. And in my opinion, Harvey needs to be explored further. He's clearly a main suspect. He was named by Eric as being the man who was at the scene of the crime. Hair samples and fingerprints need to be taken from Harvey to see if they're a match with the DNA. But I have no idea if Harvey is even living or if he can be found. But to me, I think it's still worth at least trying for the sake of justice. This case just goes to show the plight of mentally impaired people in the justice system. I'm glad in recent times things have changed. How they're, safeguarded and accommodated in interviews, but honestly, more probably could still be done. At least Oliver's case stands as a stark reminder, a piece of case law that might trigger police to think, oh, remember that case that got thrown out because the accused was mentally impaired? Maybe it'll help them reframe how they deal with vulnerable people, and especially not to interview them without a lawyer present. I'm proud of Oliver that he didn't let his case go even when he was released. He could have easily just given up and thought, okay, I'm out of prison now, but he didn't. He wasn't fighting for his release at that point. He was fighting for the truth, to set the record straight. This is the story of Oliver Campbell, the gentle giant who should have never been convicted in the first place.